A very warm welcome, everyone, to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name is Barry Sadler, and if you are a regular listener, welcome back. If you're new, then I'm sure you're going to find a lot of our podcasts interesting and engaging, regardless of whether or not you are involved directly with the sea or whether you're just interested in what happens on it. Today, I'd like to initially recount an experience that I had just the other night on board an inbound container ship, and move on from that to talk a little bit about container ship rolling and some of the incidents that have occurred because particularly mega container ships have rolled. First of all, let's talk for a little while about the increase in the size of container ships. And the 2010s, 2020 saw a massive increase in the size of container ships. Now, we went from relatively long, thin ships, so ships that were 32 to perhaps 40 metre beam tops, right up to ships that are now 62 metres in beam. During the 2010s, we saw an increase up to about 54 metres, and then as we approached 2020, just before COVID, we were maxing out at around 58 metre beam. Post-COVID, we saw the mega ships coming in, so these were the 400 by 62 metre beam ships, and we have finally topped out now in 2026 at around 24,400 TEU. So that is a displacement somewhere in the region of between 260 to 280,000 tonnes. These are big ships. But it's the beam of these ships that seems to be creating a lot of the problems at the moment. And I'll explain why a little bit later on in the podcast. So let's go back to just a few nights ago. I was piloting ships, and I was down to pilot an outward bound car carrier and then an inward bound container ship. The outward bound car carrier was a 200 metre long, what we call an R2 carrier. This is the new grade of car carrier. Instead of having the standard 32 or even 35 metre beam, these new R2 car carriers, 38 metre beams, it pushes their gross tonnage up to near on 80,000, sometimes above 80,000 gross tonnes. And obviously the number of cars in particular that this type of car ship can carry increases dramatically. One of my colleagues was doing an outbound assessment on the car carrier. He was a pilot that was stepping up to first class and needed to do an outward bound assessment on this R2 class of car carrier, this 38 beam class of car carrier. The wind was fairly light, coming from the west-southwest at around 5 to 12 knots, and it increased very, very slightly at the time of sailing from about 12 to 18 knots, once again from the west-southwest. So no real strong winds in the docks themselves. My colleague made an excellent job of getting this car carrier off the berth. He swung it to port, took it to sea without any issues whatsoever. The passage out to the pilot station was very smooth, and although the wind did pick up as we approached the main Solent itself, going round the turn known as the Bramble Turn, the wind did pick up to 25 to 30 knots. It still wasn't a gale, and conditions were still very, very reasonable. Amazingly, in the UK this winter, what we didn't have was any rain, and although there was this fresh breeze, conditions in general were pretty good. The plan for the evening was for me to disembark the car ship with my colleague and then transfer across to a container vessel coming in called the YM Tutorial. And again, I would have a pilot with me that was doing an inbound assessment on this size of ship in order to become a VLS pilot in Southampton. So assessment to assessment, which is no problem at all. Watching my colleagues manoeuvre ships and checking that they're doing everything as well as they should is something that gives me great pride, because you see the training coming through, you see your colleagues going through the ranks, gaining experience the whole time, and making a jolly good job of the acts of pilotage that I'm there to assess. But nonetheless, I was meeting up with my second colleague on the launch, and having disembarked the car carrier without any issues at all. Little bit of chop by the pilot ladder. The car carrier itself wasn't rolling. She was pitching very, very slightly. We disembarked on a 130 course. The wind was on the starboard quarter, really. It was west-southwesterly, disembarking on 130. Wind on the starboard quarter. We disembarked on the port side. Very calm disembarkation. As I say, the ship was pitching perhaps just a little bit. Into the launch, meet up with my second colleague, and then we boarded the YM tutorial. Boarded the YM tutorial much further out, so we disembarked the car carrier in the vicinity of the NAB tower. We embarked the YM tutorial around 4.5 miles south of the NAB tower. The reason that we do this so far south of the actual NAB tower itself is because we need the deep water route. At 14 metres draft, she was very, very deep, and therefore we can't come outside of the deep water channel. So to be able to shape up nicely for that channel, we board these ships much further out than we do the lighter draft vessels that don't need that deep water route. That's why we went further out, and even 4 miles south of the NAB tower, although it was choppy and occasionally the pilot launch found a heavy wave to go over, it wasn't massively rough. Wind at the time, west-southwesterly, 20 to 25 knots, perhaps the odd gust of 30 knots. Interestingly, we had some very, very poor visibility. The visibility at the NAB tower and south of it at the time was well under a mile, and we'd actually lost the foremast of this particular ship, couldn't see it any further, and so visibility was well under 2 cables, and at times less than 1 cable south of the NAB tower. Made it a real challenge for my colleague to do an assessment in those conditions, but nonetheless, that's what he was dealt with, and he got on with it. We boarded the ship, and we were mindful of our draft, mindful of the fact that we were at the start of our tidal window. Being at the start of our tidal window means that we are effectively operating in what we consider to be the minimum underkill clearance that ship can operate in. And the minimum underkill clearance we were working on was 2 metres in the deep water route. So open window, we could expect there to be an underkill clearance of 2 metres. This was verified prior to getting on the ship. I did a manual calculation to ensure that that's what we would have, and sure enough, boarding the vessel, the height of the tide was such that we had just a little bit under those 2 metres, about 1.95 metres of underkill clearance as we entered the deep water route. We boarded YM tutorial without any issue at all. Very, very short ladder up to a pilot door, and being such deep draft, the climb was only about 2, perhaps 2.5 metres. Hardly any chop or swell on the lee side of that ship, but that's to be expected for these big container ships. When I say big container ships, she was a Category 3 container vessel, so by no means the biggest in the world. But she was 334 metres long, but her beam was the impressive thing. She was right up at 48-metre beam. 48-metre beams that's the same as the beam of an original mega container ship from the 2010s, early 2020s, where we had ships at 370 metres long and 48 metres wide. These were the original ultra-large container carriers, ULCCs. So although this one was much shorter, at 334 metres, she had the same beam as those early Category 4 ultra-large ships. Very, very beamy vessel, very, very deep vessel, so there's no way we could come racing up the deep water route. Speed was agreed to be at around 9 or 10 knots, and the master confirmed that at that speed the squat would be around 0.6 of a metre, and therefore we could expect there to be approximately 1.4 metres under the keel, having dealt with squat. She was quite a slow ship. Her full ahead revolutions were only 36 RPM, with an ultra slow, very, very efficient diesel, but not necessarily a particularly fast ship. And we entered the deep water route doing much less than our expected 10 knots. We went in at about 8.5, 9 knots, and therefore the squat was much less. Very, very happy with the underkeel clearance. But interestingly, as we entered the deep water route, the ship began to roll. And it began to roll fairly heavily for this type of vessel. My colleague had the con and had the ship positioned nicely within the deep water route, so I took the opportunity of challenging the master about his GM, his metacentric height, because the way the ship was rolling felt to me as if she was very, very tender. He ran off to look at his stability data and came back and confidently told me that the ship had a GM of 3.03 centimetres. Now, this for a modern container ship is a fairly, what I would say, modest GM. When you think that a lot of these ships that are fully laden now have GMs of between 6 and 9 metres, having a GM of 3.03 centimetres was a relatively small GM for that style of container ship. At 14 metres, she was fully laden. She had a lot of cargo on deck. The containers were stacked nice and high, so I could kind of understand the GM, but I still couldn't understand why the vessel was rolling so much. Yes, okay, she had a small GM, but the forces were just not there to roll her. The helmsman wasn't using huge amounts of helm to steady the vessel on the courses that my colleague required. The swells were not that great. The car ship was pitching very, very slightly as we disembarked, but only very, very slightly. And the container ship, as we boarded it, was hardly moving at all. The ride in the pilot launch between the two vessels, although we met the odd big wind wave, there was no real swell to talk about in the launch going between the two ships. So I was quite concerned that the ship was starting to roll, and she seemed to be rolling further and further on each roll. I looked up at the inclinometer, and the inclinometer indicated that we were rolling between 3 and 4 degrees either side of the upright. Now, that might not sound much in lay terms, but when you're on a ship with such a big beam, 48 metres, 3 to 4 degree roll feels like a lot. You're watching the bridge wings, and the horizon or the backscatter from the lights on the Isle of Wight were disappearing and reappearing as the bridge ring rolled in and out of my field of view. The ship was rolling much, much heavier than I expected her to. Again, I commented to the captain, "Have you got a lot of slack tanks, Captain?" Because she seems to be very, very tender. She seems to be rolling very, very easily, considering that there are very, very small heeling forces around the ship at the moment. No, he reassured me. His tanks were all pressed up or empty, and the chief engineer had told him that there wasn't much free surface effect at all. I walked onto the bridge ring while the ship was rolling and looked down around the ship. There was a swell coming in from the southwest, so it was on the port quarter as we went up the deep water route, and the ship was, I think, reacting to this swell. Top of the deep water route, so the deep water route basically aligns at 338. Top of the deep water route, we make an alteration of course to port onto a course of about 285 to exit the deep water route and enter the main channel, going up towards Portsmouth and past Portsmouth into Southampton. As we altered course to port at the top of the deep water route, again the vessel rolled fairly heavily as she was turning. Once she steadied up on that 285 course, the rolling pretty much stopped, and the ship proceeded without much rolling at all, or heeling for that matter, for the rest of the passage all the way into the docks. I did feel for my colleague somewhat as the visibility continued to decrease throughout the district, and the two big turns that we do leading into Southampton, the West Bramble turn and the Cowshot turn, were both done with hardly any visibility at all. We certainly couldn't see the front of the ship, and very, very much reliant on our radar techniques, our electronic charts, and our portable pilot units, our PPUs, to help us round those turns. Colleague made a sterling job of the rest of the pilotage, and we finally berthed at the DP World container port in Southampton in the early hours of the morning without any real further incident. But it made me think about this rolling that we had suffered in the deep water route, and the captain asked me afterwards why I was so concerned about the rolling. I think he was kind of intimating that actually I wasn't used to rolling like that. That I wasn't used to ships moving like that because I was a pilot, and that perhaps I was concerned because the rolling made me feel uneasy. But I explained to the captain, I said, "Captain, what you forget is the beam of your vessel, and that whilst your vessel is short, it is very, very wide for its size. 48 metres beam has a considerable effect on the draft when the ship rolls." Now, if we assume that the ship rolled 3 degrees, and the inclinometer as the ship was rolling, inclinometer was unlit on that ship, and interestingly, from the 1st of January this year, all container ships above 3,000 gross tons must have an electronic inclinometer in order to record angles of heel, particularly for reasons of investigation when looking at why things went wrong. And an electronic inclinometer would have been much easier for me to see. This one was unlit, was literally just an old style inclinometer with a needle that was swinging left and to the right. And although I shone a torch up at it as the vessel was rolling, it was difficult to see. But let's assume for a moment that we were rolling 3 degrees either side. That on this 48 metre beam ship at 14 metres draft, we were rolling 3 degrees either side. What not many people appreciate, and the reason why I was concerned with the rolling, was the underkeel clearance of the vessel. By the time we entered that deep water route, we had just short of 2 metres under the keel. So 1.95. The tide was rising all the time, and in fact she was going pretty slow. And although I checked the tide prior to arrival at the deep water route, 10 minutes later we probably had over 2 metres under keel clearance as we entered that deep water route. The tide was flooding fairly hard at the time. Under keel clearance, 2 metres. The captain had said at 10 knots he was suffering squat of between 0.4 and 0.6 metres, which still left us 1.4 metres under keel, which we were happy about. The speed, in reality, was a bit slower than that on entrance to the deep water route, so I dare say the underkeel clearance, or the squat, was less, and therefore the dynamic underkeel clearance, not taking into account the roll, was perhaps slightly greater. So let's take the average. Let's say that the squat was 0.5 metre. Therefore, that left 1.5 metres under the keel. With the vessel rolling 3 degrees, if you do your mathematics, you will realise that this increases the draft by 1.2 metres. So in other words, a 3 degree roll combined with a squat of around 0.5 metre means that the effective reduction in underkeel clearance is right up there at 1.7 metres. With an underkeel clearance of 2 metres, perhaps just above 2 metres with that flood tide, that doesn't leave a lot. The deep water route is perhaps a lot deeper than advertised, so I dare say the underkeel clearance was a lot more than I'm making it out to be. I am quoting you numbers based upon the advertised depth of that deep water route. The advertised depth is 14.4 metres, and I dare say there are places along that deep water route where we are well over 15.5 metres. So the numbers I'm giving you are based upon the advertised charted depth. But nonetheless, that roll of 3 degrees put the vessel into a situation where her underkeel clearance was a lot less than that was initially planned. Now, you could say that the reason that we work on 2 metres under keel is to take into account these things, is to take into account the possibility of squat, take into account the possibility of roll, take into account the possibility of heel as we turn the vessel. And that's absolutely true. And on this occasion, it worked. The vessel handled very, very well, which indicates to me that she was nowhere near that 0.3 to 0.4 remaining underkeel clearance that the numbers on paper would say was remaining, if we take into account that additional draft of 1.21 to be exact, metres caused by the 3 degree roll at 14 metres draft on a 48 metre beam ship. But why was the ship rolling so much in the deep water route? So that got me thinking, and that got me looking at the latest, if you say, news about container ship rolling. And a lot of it, of course, revolves around the loss of containers. There have been a lot of containers lost over the side in the last 10 years. Amazingly, approximately per year, ships have lost 1,274 containers. In total, by the way, that's not each ship. Yeah. So in total, the average loss of containers overboard is 1,274 containers. That is a lot of containers washed over the sides of ships. Now, most of them go over the side because the ship finds itself in heavy weather. But heavy weather isn't just automatically going to cause containers to go over the side. There are lots of other factors that come into play with the heavy weather that may cause these containers to be overboard from the ship on such a huge scale. Some recent cases, one of which I want to focus on, some recent cases, examples for you. 2014, Svenborg Maersk lost 517 containers in the Bay of Biscay, having encountered 10-metre waves associated with hurricane force winds. The Maersk Honum lost a lot of containers over the side after a massive fire and explosion in the Indian Ocean. That was in 2018. The case I want to talk about, the MSC Zoe, was 2019. 342 containers lost over the side in the North Sea off of the island of Texel in Holland. And that was after heavy rolling and suspected bottom touching during a storm at the Wadden Islands. Biggest one, the biggest ever non-sinking losses in history, occurred from a container ship called the One Apus, which in the North Pacific in 2020 lost a total of 1,816 containers in one single incident. As far as financial losses are concerned, that was one of the largest non-sinking losses in history. 1,816 containers, that's lost overboard. That doesn't include those containers that were damaged on deck by the falling stacks. 2021, the Maersk Essen lost 750 containers in the North Pacific whilst encountering severe weather en route from China to Los Angeles. 2021 saw the Zim Kingston lose 109 containers off British Columbia in Canada when she rolled heavily in a storm, which was followed by a nasty fire on board. The Cape of Good Hope in 2024 has claimed somewhere in the region of 200 containers from various ships going around the Cape of Good Hope. Obviously, they are forced around the Cape of Good Hope because still the Red Sea is not a great place to be, and so ship owners are sending their ships round the Cape instead of through Suez, and therefore they are meeting some nasty weather around the Cape, and that in 2024 resulted in 200 containers being lost overboard. Now, we talked about the GM of the ships and the fact that the GM of the container ship that was rolling on me was only 3 metres, whereas the GM of a lot of these mega ships, even when they're fully laden, is right up there at between 6 and 9 metres. But we improved on the GMs somewhat by IMO 380 being enforced from 2016. IMO 380 is what we call the VGM resolution. And that was a resolution from the IMO that said that every single container must have a verified gross mass. So what this meant was that a shipper, before they put a container on a container ship, must have had it weighed by an approved method and send to the ship a verified gross mass certificate. So that's a certificate saying, I've weighed my container and my container weighs this much. Why is that important? That's important for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's important because it allows us to understand more accurately the distribution of weight on a container ship and therefore verify more accurately what the calculated GM is. But also, it means that if we do have containers that are particularly heavy, they aren't placed very, very high up on stacks where they are subject to the accelerative forces of a ship rolling. So IMO 380, the verified gross mass resolution, had a big effect. And at the end of the day, if you've not verified the gross mass of your container, it cannot be loaded. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's impossible to monitor that because you have these container ships, biggest in the world now, carrying 24,500 TEUs on board. How on earth are you going to keep track of every single VGM certificate? And the way it works is that these containers come with an EVGM certificate, an electronic verified gross mass certificate. What happens is the container is weighed through one of the approved methods. The verified gross mass is declared. This is recorded on an electronic certificate, and the electronic certificate is tagged to that container. If, when the container comes to load, that electronic certificate is not present, and this was the case on a ship not 2 weeks ago in Southampton, where the container had to be discharged again because the EVGM certificate was not present, then the container should not be loaded in the first place, and the ship certainly shouldn't go to sea without a full raft of VGM certificates for every single container on board the ship. As I say, that's done electronically, normally by the terminal, and so therefore we end up with a very, very accurate indication of the weight of those containers. So no heavy containers at the top of the stack, and the GM of the vessel, the actual stability condition of the vessel, can be calculated a lot more accurately. Heavier containers can put further down in the vessel to increase the GM. When I talk to pilots that were specialist pilots on very large container ships, when the big ones first came out, they would always complain about the heel on the turn. This is because it was pre-IMO 380. In other words, some of the containers that were loaded on board the ship, they probably didn't know exactly what the weight of that container was. So therefore, they ended up with GMs that were perhaps a little bit smaller than they should have been, and therefore these vessels were heeling more as they were turned by pilots, particularly in the early 2010, 2011 era, before the 2016 implementation of 380. So 380 helped a lot, but 380 perhaps was doing more damage than good, because ships started to be designed where GMs were no longer an issue. And so the issue became tall stacks. So what 380 did was 380 made sure that the heaviest containers were not put at the top of the stacks. Because if you've got the heaviest container at the top, when the ship starts to roll and that container goes through the acceleration forces of that ship rolling heavily, a heavy container is more likely to fall from the top of the stack or cause the stack to collapse. Once a stack starts to collapse, it collapses against the stack next to it, which is only designed to hold its own weight, not the weight of the stack next to it. So that also starts to collapse. That collapses onto the next stack, and it's a bit like a domino effect. Once a stack has started to collapse, the weight against the lashings of the stack next to it, the lashings just won't hold it. They are designed to hold the weight of that tier of containers only, not the additional weight of a bay of containers next to it that has fallen against it. So you get a domino effect. So the biggest, heaviest containers were not put at the top, they were put down below. But what did that do? That drove the centre of gravity of the ship down and down and down. This increased the metacentric height, increased the GM, and therefore gave us what we call stiff ships. My container ship the other day was 3 meters GM, and she was rolling relatively slowly, but rolling quite far. GM of 9 meters was what the MSC Zoe had when she had her incident in the North Sea. And the MSC Zoe incident is one that I read through to try and understand what was happening with the dynamics of this container ship, because I've got a feeling that the dynamics that this container ship suffered off the coast of Texel when she lost all of those containers was similar to the dynamics that I was feeling. She was navigating with the seas from behind in a shallow area, and two things happen when you are navigating ships in shallower areas in following seas. One, the wave period changes. So the swells coming into shallow slow down and build up, and the period in between the swells reduces. It's one of the reasons why the length of launch that we use to get out to ships at the NAB is so critical, because the wave pattern of the swells and the wind waves coming in over the shallow chalk shoals beneath the NAB cause these seas to build up and these swells to shorten. That's what happened to the MSC Zoe. She was navigating along the traffic separation scheme off the Dutch islands. So if you imagine the Dutch coast, there's a line of islands just to the north of the Dutch coast. I always remember the name Texel because there's a Texel race, which is a very famous sailing race that goes around Texel Island. There's Texel Island and a whole string of islands run across that north coast. To the north of that, you've got a traffic separation scheme. And in that traffic separation scheme, you've got reduced underkill clearance. Seas that have built up in the North Sea will be blown in a southwesterly and west-southwesterly wind, blown along the coast of northern Holland, and that will cause the same effect as we get at the NAB Tower. The swells period will shorten and the swells will build very, very steep. Why is this an issue? This is an issue because it can give rise to parametric rolling. Parametric rolling is blamed for the majority of container losses over the side of the ship. Parametric rolling is something that can happen very, very quickly, as did the other day with me on my container ship. And I'm convinced that although parametric rolling only rolled us 3 degrees, we were suffering the same phenomena. But because the swells were relatively low, as I've described, the phenomena did not create a particularly large roll. Parametric rolling is where the rolling period of the ship is twice that of the wave period. So what we mean by that is that imagine a ship rolling. Yeah, when the ship is upright, the crest of the wave is in the centre of the ship. Yeah, when the ship rolls over to one way, the crests of the wave are at the bow and the stern of the ship. What effect does this have? Well, if you imagine the ship rolling, as the ship rolls over one way, because there are crests of waves, particularly at the stern and the front of the ship, there's a lot of force that brings the ship upright. But as it brings the ship upright, the wave is in the middle. With the wave in the middle, we've got less of the ship in the water, and therefore there's nothing to stop the ship rolling the other way. As the ship rolls further the other way, the waves come along again and the crests are at the bow and the stern, and this gives us that big righting lever which shoots the vessel upright. Again, as the vessel comes upright, with the crest amidships, very, very little to stop that vessel continuing to roll the other way. And if parametric rolling is allowed to develop, then the angle of heel will just get larger and larger and larger until it starts to have an effect on the containers themselves. It's not just parametric rolling on its own, though, that causes it to be so dangerous. And in the case of the MSC Zoe, she had a GM of around 9 meters. That's what we call a stiff ship. That means that when she is at the extremity of her roll and we've got the crest of the wave at the bow and the stern of the ship, we have a massive righting lever. Take into account the big beams of these ships, and the righting levers are huge, and this will bring the ship upright very, very quickly, sometimes violently. If the wave crest is midships, as that ship is righting itself so fast, there's nothing to stop the momentum of the roll going the other way, because less of the ship is in the water with the crest amidships. The vessel will then roll violently the other way. Along comes the next crest, big GM, big righting lever, vessel comes upright very, very quickly, and so the process continues. Parametric rolling causes the vessel to roll to greater and greater angles of heel, and unless the rolling period of the ship changes by a ship changing its GM, or the course of the ship is altered, as parametric rolling is at its worst when the seas are either right ahead or right astern, if parametric rolling is allowed to develop, then there's the real possibility that the angles of heel will be so great that containers will be lost over the side of the ship. The MSC Zoe suffered parametric rolling, but I think what caught my eye with her report was that it all happened in shallow water. They actually think, and they modelled the fact that she probably touched the bottom as she was rolling, because she was rolling so heavily with her huge beam. She was a 58-metre beam ship. There's a good possibility that due to the underkill clearance, she may have briefly even touched the bottom as she was rolling. So it caught my eye that this was a ship that rolled very, very heavily as she entered shallow waters to the north of the Netherlands coast. We entered shallow waters with the seas behind us on our container ship the other day. And because the swells were so small, the heeling forces behind those swells were not great. But I still think we suffered a slight bit of parametric rolling as we entered the deep water channel at Southampton. It's no other reason I can see for the large rolling period that we had. We had to alter course from 338 round to 285, and that alteration, of course, a little bit like a master avoiding parametric rolling, stopped the roll. But I sometimes think what would happen if we had to stay on that 338 course for another 10 minutes longer. Would that parametric rolling have continued? Would the angle of roll increased? Would we have eventually, if the angle of roll had got over 5 degrees, would we have even touched the bottom of the deep water route as we rolled? It's a phenomena that we associate with big storms in the middle of the ocean, where we have the biggest waves and the biggest seas. But as I discovered, smaller swells built up over a shallow area can have equally as dramatic effect on the ship. It's time, I think, for all of us, but particularly pilots who pilot or who captain or who are even officer of the watch on very large container vessels, to realise that once you enter shallow water with a little bit of a swell running, you've really got to be careful with what that ship's doing. And if the swell forecast, and that swell is forecast to be either directly or nearly directly from astern or ahead or nearly directly from ahead, that the underkill clearance of your ultra-large container ship is perhaps increased another half, perhaps even another metre, to account for the possibility that although you're not going to dangerously parametrically roll, you may still parametrically roll and therefore increase your draft beyond what you would expect it to be. Thank you very much for listening to this podcast. I hope you found it interesting. I certainly found it interesting, particularly looking at the MSC Zoe report. You can find the MSC Zoe report online, just type it in. It's from the Dutch Safety Board under the authority of the Panama Maritime Authority. So it's there, and it really is worth a read. It was between the 1st and 2nd of January 2019 she lost all of those containers. Google the report, give it a read. It's really, really interesting how that ship behaved. Thanks a lot, guys. We look forward to welcoming you back to the Maritime Education Podcast again soon. But in the meantime, have a great day, everybody, and thank you very much for listening. And of course, don't forget, guys, if you enjoyed this podcast, please do subscribe to it by clicking the subscribe button on your podcast provider. It will be great to see you back here.